Just after 5 p.m. on Halloween 1957, in a Los Angeles suburb called Sun Valley, 35-year-old Peter Fabiano turned off the lights at his beauty salon, flipped the sign in his shop window from open to closed, and got into his car to begin the short drive home. Peter turned onto a long residential street and pulled into the driveway of a corner house at the end of the block. Peter put the car in park and just sat for a moment. As he stared at the Halloween decorations his wife had hung on the windows, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He couldn't believe this was his house. And to him, his house was sort of a symbol of how dramatically his life had recently changed. Just a few short years earlier, Peter had felt completely lost. He was living by himself and struggling to make ends meet. And that's when he got mixed up with some bad people who said he could make some money working for them. Even though Peter had agreed to do this, he had known it was not a smart decision, and he was quickly proven right when he ran into trouble with the law. Peter ultimately avoided doing jail time, but this had been a wake-up call for him. After that, he had worked hard to clean up his act and to really start planning for his future. And his hard work eventually paid off. Now he was married and ran a successful business, and he owned a brand new home that had literally just been built. In short, Peter Fabiano was living the American dream. And on top of that, he was enjoying the kind of personal freedom that he had personally fought for on the front lines during World War II. Life was good. Peter strolled up his front walkway between the rows of carved Halloween pumpkins and stepped inside his house. His wife Betty walked up to him, carrying a large bucket full of candy, and as she placed the candy on a table near the door, Peter gave his wife a peck on the cheek. Betty smiled and then quickly turned and walked away. And Peter wondered if maybe Betty's smile was forced, and if maybe she was mad about something. As happy as Peter was about his job and his new house in the suburbs, he and Betty's marriage had its share of difficulties. In fact, just that summer, a few months earlier, things had gotten so tense between them that Betty had moved out for a while. But she had come back, and things had really seemed like they were getting better between them. And so Peter decided to ask a simple question just to gauge Betty's mood. He said, "Hey, have any trick-or-treaters come by yet?" And to Peter's relief, Betty laughed and told him it was still too early. All the trick-or-treaters were probably still eating dinner. Peter relaxed, convinced he'd been reading way too much into his wife's smile, and he started to get excited about handing out candy to a parade of children in funny costumes. In the 1950s in the United States, the act of trick-or-treating had really started to become a popular Halloween tradition for children, and the holiday itself was growing into the huge part of American pop culture that it is today. When Peter was a kid, he didn't get to go trick-or-treating. It wasn't really a thing back then. But now, even though he was an adult, he was quite happy to be a part of it, even if his role was just handing out candy. Peter's teenage stepdaughter, Judy, came bounding out of her room in full costume, dressed as Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She said she was heading out to a Halloween party, and she had a ride there, but she would need a ride home. Peter said no problem, he'd come pick her up, but no later than 10 p.m. because it was a school night. Judy huffed and said fine before telling him where she'd be and walking out the door. By 6 o'clock, shortly after Judy had left for her party, the sun was setting and the Fabiano's doorbell rang for the first time that night. Peter and Betty heard a chorus of young voices chanting "Trick or treat" from right outside the door. Betty smiled, put on her pointy black witch's hat, grabbed the bucket of candy by its handles, and opened up the door. In front of her stood a little boy in a robot costume, and on either side of him were what Betty assumed were his two big sisters, both dressed as fairies. Betty reached into her bucket and grabbed as much candy as her hand could fit, and then dropped the candy into each of the kids' bags. The kids thanked her and ran off. At this point, Peter walked up behind Betty to look outside, and he saw more children approaching. And it looked like it was going to be a busy night. A little before 11 p.m. that night, after the last of the trick-or-treaters had come by the house, and Peter had picked up his stepdaughter Judy from her Halloween party, Peter walked into his bedroom and saw Betty reading in bed. He slipped into his pajamas and yawned. He thought about how he and Betty would have to be up at the crack of dawn tomorrow to get Judy to school, and also then to open the two salons they ran for a full day of appointments. And so all Peter wanted to do was just collapse and go to sleep. And so Peter slid into bed with Betty, but then put her book down on the nightstand and she turned off the lamp. As the couple lay in bed, Peter remarked to Betty that this time of the year was exhausting. Betty agreed. Decorating, hosting, entertaining, these things were hard work. She said now that Halloween was over, they would have to start sending invitations for Thanksgiving. And then as soon as Thanksgiving was over, they wouldn't even have time to breathe before they'd have to start decorating for Christmas and planning their big Christmas party. Peter joked that maybe next year they should just board up their house for the holidays and take an extended vacation. Betty started to laugh, but before she could say anything else, their doorbell rang. Peter sat up, switched on the lamp, and looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. He turned to Betty and said it seemed really strange that somebody would ring their doorbell so late. Betty thought it might just be a late trick-or-treater, even though more than 2 hours had passed since the last trick-or-treater had come by. Peter pushed himself out of bed. Maybe it was one of the earlier visitors coming back for seconds, he said. If so, it was their lucky night, because they still had more than enough candy to last through the new year. Peter put on his robe, stepped into his slippers, and began walking towards the front door. And as he did, the doorbell rang again. And this time, Peter heard "trick or treat" from a voice calling out from the other side of the door. And so Peter picked up the bucket of candy on the side table, reached for the doorknob, and pulled the front door open. A few minutes later, Sun Valley police officer Bud Alper was fast asleep in his bed, 2 doors down from Peter and Betty's house, when suddenly this violent pounding noise jolted him awake. The pounding persisted as Alper slowly gained his bearings, and he realized that somebody was banging on the front door of his house. Alper picked up his watch from the nightstand and looked at the time, and when he saw how late it was, he instinctively began reaching for his service revolver. He had no idea what was going on, but someone banging on his door this late definitely couldn't be something good. But just then, he heard the sound of a young woman's voice, tearfully calling his name, pleading with him to open the door. Alper opened his front door, and through bleary eyes, he saw his teenage neighbor, Judy, the daughter of Betty Fabiano, standing there in her nightgown with tears streaming down her cheeks. Judy begged Alper to help her. Her stepfather had been shot, she said. He was lying on the floor of their house, dying. Alper ran out of the house and followed Judy to her front door and stopped just outside the doorway. Alper saw Peter lying motionless on the floor, partially blocking the entrance to the house. Alper quickly stepped over him and darted inside the house, and he saw Betty, Peter's wife, standing frozen in the hallway with her hand over her mouth, looking like she was in shock. Alper asked where their phone was, and Judy pointed towards the kitchen. Five minutes later, an ambulance pulled up at the Fabiano's house, and paramedics picked Peter up, put him on a stretcher, and sped away to the hospital. Officer Bill Lehman of the Sun Valley Police Department parked his cruiser at the Fabiano house just as the ambulance left, and he walked up to the front door. Lehman greeted his fellow officer, Bud Alper, who was standing on the walkway in his pajama robe and lighting a cigarette. Standing near her was Mrs. Fabiano, who was sobbing, and when Officer Lehman approached her, she began to recount what had happened. Betty said that shortly after she and her husband had gone to bed, their doorbell had rang, and they both assumed it was just a late trick-or-treater. Betty said she had stayed in bed while Peter had gone to the door. From bed, Betty had heard her husband open the front door and say, "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" She then heard someone with a strange voice reply, "No," and a few seconds later, Betty heard a loud pop, followed by a thud. As Betty got out of bed and began running to the front of the house, she heard tires screeching and a car speeding away, and there, at the foot of the front door, she found her husband lying on the rug, bleeding from a wound in his chest. Betty told the officer that, based on the tone of her husband's voice after he opened the door, she was pretty sure that whoever he was talking to at the door was an adult, and she could almost swear that the voice she heard in response to him sounded like a man impersonating a woman. Lehman furrowed his eyebrows as he jotted down this strange detail in his notepad. Was the person at the door using a fake voice, because Peter would have recognized them otherwise? And if this was the case, did it mean they were also wearing some sort of costume? It was Halloween after all. Lehman walked back to his cruiser, reached inside of it, and then returned to the front door with a small box. He placed the box over the doorbell and secured it there with some tape. That way nobody could touch it before crime scene investigators showed up to dust for prints. Officer Lehman turned to Betty and asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Peter or wanted Peter dead. Betty hesitated just for a second and then shook her head. She said she couldn't think of anybody. A short time later, homicide detective Pat Keeley rolled up to the Fabiano house and took over the investigation. Officer Lehman briefed Detective Keeley on the details of what had happened, and then Keeley approached Betty. He took off his hat, lowered his head a bit, and said he hated to have to tell her this, but her husband Peter never regained consciousness, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Betty immediately broke down and began crying and hugged her daughter. Keeley stepped away to give the victim's grieving family members some space, and as the crime scene investigators showed up to process the scene, Keeley walked across the street to begin his neighborhood canvass. Keeley knocked on the door of the Fabiano's adjacent neighbors and asked if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. The neighbors told the detective that they had heard a loud pop, maybe about 15 minutes earlier, but aside from that, they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. As the detective scribbled this into his notepad, the neighbor suddenly remembered something he didn't think much of at the time. He said a couple of times that evening, when he would look out the window to see if there were any more trick-or-treaters coming, he noticed a car parked in the street that he'd never seen before. It was an older model, dark-colored sedan, and by his count, it had been parked there for maybe at least an hour, but now it was gone. The neighbor wished he could provide more information, but he didn't take note of the make or model, and he wasn't able to offer a description of anybody in the car. Keeley continued canvassing the neighborhood, but none of the other people on the block saw or heard anything unusual. So he returned to the Fabiano house, hoping that the crime scene investigators had found something useful that might help him close this case quickly. But the news from the other investigators was equally disappointing. There were no fingerprints on the doorbell and no shell casings at the scene. In fact, they hadn't uncovered anything at all, not a single piece of evidence. This crime scene was totally clean. A little later that night, Keeley returned to his desk in the homicide department to begin writing up the report. The 46-year-old veteran took a deep breath and exhaled in a long sigh. He knew he was in for a long night, and he was at an age where he was beginning to wonder if his 95% homicide clearance rate was worth the toll these long nights must be taking on his health. Keeley finished writing up the report and then began looking over what he'd written. He kept thinking how unusual it was that the killers took advantage of Halloween and used trick-or-treating as a ruse. He'd never heard of this happening before, except maybe in a radio play he once listened to. And the crime scene was so spotless. The killers were very careful to not leave anything behind. This suggested a level of planning and organization rarely seen in random killings and robberies. This had all the markings of a professional hit. The day after the murder, Detective Keeley drove down to the Hall of Justice and made his way to the Records Division. He wanted to find out if Peter had any sort of criminal background or maybe a connection to the mob that might have led a professional hitman to show up at his door and kill him. Keeley asked the records clerk for anything he could dig up on a Peter R. Fabiano. The records clerk disappeared into a back room, and a short time later, he returned with a file and handed it to Keeley. And the second Keeley opened that file up and began reading, he knew his instincts had paid off. Peter Fabiano did have a criminal record. About 9 years earlier, Peter had been a bookie, which meant he was setting up gambling bets, taking bet money, and paying out winnings. This was illegal, and Peter had been caught and convicted on a bookmaking charge. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, but the sentence was ultimately suspended, and he never served any time. Keeley knew that bookies were often associated with organized crime, and he wondered how deep Peter's ties went. Could he have run afoul of a loan shark, or fallen in debt to the wrong people? Something like that would definitely support his professional killer theory. Detective Keeley spent the afternoon probing Peter's business records, his finances, his background, hoping to find other investigations and other shady dealings. Anything that might help Keeley build a list of Peter's potential enemies. But much to Keeley's surprise, aside from that one scrape with the law being a bookie almost a decade earlier, Peter really did seem to have cleaned up his life. He ran a legitimate business, which his wife helped him operate, and none of Peter's friends that Keeley had talked to could think of anyone who had beef with him. However, Keely had yet to really have a deep conversation with the one person closest to Peter, and that would be Peter's wife and now widow, Betty. That evening, Betty Fabiano sat in a small room inside the Sun Valley Police Station. After waiting for a few minutes on her own, Detective Keely walked in, sat down in a chair a few feet away from her, and asked her to take him through the night of Peter's murder again. Betty started recounting everything that had happened that day, starting from when she had finished working at one of the two salons she and Peter owned. Peter, at the time, was working at the other salon. Keely listened closely, looking for any inconsistencies between this version of events and the story Betty had told him when he had first come to her house. Keely was not ready to write off the idea that a hired killer had shot Peter, but maybe it wasn't the mob that hired them. Maybe it was the victim's wife. But as Betty spoke, Keely didn't catch anything that strayed too far from her original story. Still, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Some people were good at memorizing stories. And so Keely asked Betty to tell him more about her marriage to Peter. Betty explained that she and Peter had been married for about 3 years. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and one of those kids, her daughter Judy, lived with them. Keely asked if she and Peter had any problems in their marriage. Betty paused, then took a deep breath, and admitted that, yes, there had been some marital problems. She said their marriage had become pretty rocky earlier that year, to the point where they actually had separated for a couple of months. Betty had moved out of the house during that time and went to live with a friend. But in July, she and Peter had reconciled, and she had moved back in with him. Betty looked away for a minute and was silent, and then she turned back to Keely and said there was someone he should know about, someone who might have had it out for Peter. Keely leaned in and asked her why she hadn't said anything about this person when he talked to her at the house. Betty said she wasn't trying to hide anything. She'd been in total shock at the house, and she hadn't been able to think clearly. But now that she was talking about her and Peter's relationship, it seemed obvious, because she believed this person truly hated Peter, maybe enough to want him dead. It was a woman named Joan Rabel, who used to work part-time for Peter at one of his salons. But Peter had fired Joan because for some reason he just didn't like her. But Betty did. In fact, the 2 women had quickly hit it off when they first met and had become friends. And this really bothered Peter. In fact, it bothered Peter so much that the friendship between Joan and Betty became a source of tension in their marriage, until Peter ultimately forbade his wife to socialize with Joan. Betty felt she had a right to choose her friends and was not going to let her husband control her, but Peter was insistent until Betty felt like he was basically giving her an ultimatum. And ultimately, this is the issue that led Betty and Peter to separate for those several months. However, Betty said after a couple of months of separation, she had a change of heart and returned home to Peter. And he accepted her back, but under the condition that she never see Joan and never even speak Joan's name around him again. As Keely listened to the story, he found himself puzzled by it. It sounded like there had to be a piece missing somewhere. And so he asked Betty, why did Peter hate Joan so much? But Betty just sort of shrugged and looked away. Keely couldn't tell if Betty was hiding this information because she knew more about Peter's murder than she was saying, or if she was trying to hide something to protect her dead husband or her friend Joan. Finally, Betty broke the silence and just said that Joan had a really strong personality, and Peter also had a strong personality. And sometimes 2 strong personalities can clash. The next morning, 2 days after Peter's murder, Keely and his partner decided to pay Joan a surprise visit. They drove to Joan's house in Hollywood, on the other side of the hill, and knocked on her front door. The door swung open and Joan appeared, and as the detectives flashed their badges and said they were there to talk to her about Peter Fabiano, they watched Joan closely to see how she would react, whether she'd be nervous or surprised or something. But Joan just shook her head and looked down. She had already heard the news. How tragic, she said to the investigators. Keely agreed and said it was tragic, but also her name had come up as a potential suspect, so they needed her to accompany them down to the station and answer some questions. Joan matter-of-factly just said, okay, and asked them to hold on a minute while she got her coat. And as she did that, the investigators shared a look, because honestly, this seemed really strange to them. In almost every homicide case they had ever worked, when somebody was told they were a potential suspect, they got scared or angry or had some kind of strong reaction. Neither of the cops had ever seen someone act so unaffected by this kind of news. They followed Joan inside the house and kept an eye on her while she grabbed her coat and her purse. And she remained totally calm and cooperative when the detectives walked her to their car and drove her back to the valley to police headquarters. As soon as Joan was sitting down inside of the interview room across from Keeley and his partner, she began to talk. Joan insisted that she had nothing to do with Peter's murder. She was not a violent person, she hated guns. In fact, she had never even touched a gun, not once in her whole life. And as Joan continued to talk, Keeley began to notice her calm demeanor slip just a little. She didn't sound angry, she just sounded sort of surprised. She told the detectives she had no idea what they'd heard or who they'd heard it from, but she had no problem whatsoever with Peter Fabiano. She considered both Peter and his wife Betty to be two of her closest friends, and she had only stopped working at the salon because she'd found another job. So, Joan suggested, whoever was pointing the finger at her, the police might want to take a closer look at them. Keeley and his partner exchanged another brief glance. What Joan was saying was a complete contradiction to what Betty had said. Keeley's partner asked Joan if she had an alibi for the night of the murder. She told them she did. She said she had been home all night by herself, but her car had been parked in the front of her house in her driveway, and she was sure one of her neighbors could confirm that. After speaking to Joan for a bit longer, Keeley had his suspicions, but he had no legal reason to hold Joan, so he gave her a ride back to her house. And after Joan went inside and closed the door behind her, Keeley began knocking on her neighbors' doors. And several of them did confirm what Joan told detectives. On the night Peter died, Joan's car never left her driveway. And considering that her house was 12.5 miles away from the Fabiano house, it did seem likely if she was involved somehow in the murder that she would have had to drive there. Keeley returned to the station, went right to his desk, and shook his head in frustration. Less than 2 days into this investigation, and he felt as though the case was already reaching a dead end. Beyond Peter's brief stint as a bookie, nothing had come up that showed he still had ties to organized crime, or that he owed money to anybody. Betty and Joan had told him wildly different stories about Joan's relationship with Peter, so he figured one of them had to be lying. But the lie didn't have to mean they were connected to the murder. The lie could be for some personal reason. And at this point, there was no clear evidence pointing to either of the women. Keeley definitely couldn't rule them out, but he also couldn't really pursue either of them unless some new piece of information surfaced. So Keeley picked up his case file and began scouring the dozen or so pages he'd put together so far, looking for anything he might have missed. But after an hour of studying the facts of the case, he put down the file and felt no closer to an answer. Keeley's nearly perfect homicide clearance rate, which was a great source of professional pride to him, seemed like it was about to take a hit. Nearly a week after the murder, on November 5th, 1957, Peter Fabiano was laid to rest. Following the funeral, Detective Keeley continued to interview Peter's friends and family, but these conversations never seemed to get him anything new. Several more weeks passed, and no matter how many times Keeley looked over his case file, he didn't get any closer to figuring out who had murdered Peter. And with nothing more to go on, and new cases piling up, Detective Keeley and his team turned their attention to other open investigations. The Fabianos' Thanksgiving dinner that year had one fewer face at the table, and while they ate, there was this sense of despair hanging over all of them. Like Keeley, Peter's family started to feel that Peter's case would just never get solved. But on a day not long after Thanksgiving, in early December, the telephone rang at the Sun Valley Police Department. A muffled voice on the other end of the line told the dispatcher they had a tip in the Peter Fabiano case. The caller said that if investigators went to Bullock's department store in downtown Los Angeles and visited the area with the rented storage lockers, they would find a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. This was the gun that was used to kill Peter Fabiano. The caller then provided a locker number and then hung up without giving their name. The dispatcher took down the information and quickly passed it along to Detective Keeley. Keeley was skeptical that this tip would lead anywhere. Whenever a case was all over the news like this one, he usually got at least one call from somebody just looking for attention. Rarely was a vital piece of information just handed to him. It's never that easy. But Keeley was a diligent investigator who followed up on basically every single lead. And so far, the Fabiano case had offered very few. So this was something worth looking into. So Keeley and his partner drove to downtown Los Angeles, entered the Bullock's department store, and had the locker attendant open up the locker the tipster had indicated. And when Keeley looked inside that locker, he couldn't hide his excitement because there inside of it was in fact a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Keeley asked the locker attendant whose name the locker had been rented under. The attendant opened a registration book, and when she read the name to Keeley, Keeley had never heard of them before. Keeley put the revolver into an evidence bag and drove it back to the station. He knew he would need to figure out where the gun came from, who the gun was registered to, and if the gun had ever been reported stolen. He also knew there was a good chance the locker had been rented under a false name, but he hoped the gun would still lead him to Peter's killer. So he called the state police and gave them the serial number of this gun. And within minutes, Keeley learned that the gun had been purchased on September 21st of that year, the month before the murder, from a gun shop in Pasadena, about 15 miles away. And the buyer of the gun was the very same person who rented the storage locker where the gun was found. This person had not used a fake name to get the gun or the locker. So Keeley could easily track them down, and he was now almost positive this person killed Peter. That evening, after obtaining a warrant, Detective Keeley and his partner arrested the person who had bought the gun and stored it in the locker. The detectives brought this person to the station and sat them down in the interrogation room, and as soon as the interview began, this person openly admitted to shooting Peter Fabiano. And they would tell investigators the entire story right from the very beginning all the way up to the aftermath of the killing. And once Keeley and his partner had all these details, all the pieces began falling into place. And everything that might have confused Keeley early on now suddenly made perfect sense. Based on the killer's confession and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Peter Fabiano on the night of October 31st, 1957. At around 9 p.m. that night, the killer, wearing face makeup and baggy clothes, sat in a parked car a few houses down from Peter's, and just watched and waited. Just after 11 p.m., so after sitting in the parked car for 2 straight hours, the killer saw the bedroom lights in the Fabiano house go off. At this point, the killer slipped a mask over their face and red gloves over their hands, and then climbed out of the car and began walking toward the Fabiano's front door, carrying a brown paper bag with a .38 caliber revolver hidden inside of it. The killer rang the doorbell, and as soon as they did, they began to shake, knowing they were about to commit a crime that could land them in the gas chamber. They tried to calm their nerves by reassuring themselves that this was the perfect crime and there was no way they'd get caught. They repeated this in their head as they rang the doorbell again and called out "Trick or treat" in a loud, booming, unnatural voice. Peter opened the door, looked at the killer in their ill-fitting clothes and paper mask, and laughed. "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" he asked. All the killer could think to say was "no," as Peter looked down into his bucket and began fishing for candy. With Peter's attention distracted for just a moment, the killer began raising the gun, which was still concealed inside the paper bag. But as they did, their hands began to tremble violently, so they reached over with their other hand to keep themselves steady, and then continued lifting the gun with both hands. And once it was aimed squarely at Peter's chest, they fired a single shot. The bullet blew a hole through the paper bag and slammed into Peter's chest, the round settling just below his heart. Peter looked up at the killer in horror and then clutched his chest as he fell to the ground. The killer immediately turned around, cut across the yard, and ran back to the car. When they got into the passenger seat, they were shaking and on the verge of tears. They couldn't believe they had just killed a man. But the killer then felt a hand on their shoulder. They turned to the driver's seat and saw the woman they loved had a smile on her face. The woman told the killer they had done everything just right. Then she hit the gas and sped away from the neighborhood. It would turn out Peter Fabiano's killer was a woman named Goldine Pizer. She was a 42-year-old lab assistant at a children's hospital, and she had no direct connection to Peter Fabiano. In fact, she had never met him before the night she killed him. She only knew what Peter looked like because another person had driven her by the Fabiano house a week before Halloween and pointed him out. And this other person was Goldine's only connection to Peter, and this other person was the actual mastermind behind the murder. And that was Peter's former employee, Joan Rabel. It turned out that Joan and Peter's wife Betty had both lied to police about their relationship. Joan and Betty were not just friends, they were lovers. But in 1957, that was not something most people would accept, so Betty and Joan tried to hide it. However, Peter still found out about their relationship, and when he did, he was livid. He fired Joan from his salon and forbade his wife from ever seeing Joan again. But instead of submitting, Betty left her husband and went to live with Joan. However, after a couple of months with Joan, Betty realized she was better off staying with Peter and broke off her relationship with Joan. Betty moved back in with Peter and agreed to never bring up Joan's name again. And it was at this point that Joan began plotting Peter's murder. Jilted and wanting revenge, Joan began a new relationship with the very impressionable Goldine and immediately began setting her up to become Peter's assassin. Joan spoke endlessly to Goldine about what an evil and vile person Peter Fabiano was. Joan claimed Peter was cruel to his wife and cruel to his wife's children, mistreated his employees, and was essentially a monster who needed to be stopped. Over time, Goldine grew to despise Peter just through Joan's portrait of him, and that's when Joan began actively putting her plan into motion. Goldine cared so deeply for Joan, she would have done just about anything for her. And so when she walked into that Pasadena gun shop on September 21st, she felt like she was doing a heroic thing. Once the two conspirators had their plan all worked out, they decided Halloween night was the best time to carry it out, because they knew Peter would be more likely to open his door to a stranger after a steady stream of trick-or-treaters had been to his house. On the night of the murder, Joan borrowed a friend's car, leaving hers in the driveway to create the alibi, and then went to pick up Goldine at her house. Joan then drove Goldine to the Fabiano street, waited in the car until the deed was done, and drove her back home. At which point, Joan told Goldine to forget they ever knew each other and vanished from her life. Once Goldine realized she'd been used and manipulated by Joan, who didn't actually care about her, the hold that Joan had over her was broken. So when Detective Keeley got the anonymous tip and tracked Goldine down, she was more than willing to tell him everything. Joan Rabel and Goldine Pizer were both charged with first-degree murder. Both women initially pleaded not guilty, but eventually changed their pleas to guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Joan and Goldine received sentences of 5 years to life in prison. As for Peter's widow, Betty Fabiano, she was never charged with any crime because investigators were satisfied that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez returned home to their family's mansion in Beverly Hills and knew right away something was wrong. The driveway gate was unlocked, and then they went to their front door and it was already open. They pushed the door open and cautiously walked inside and saw there was blood on the ground and looked in their TV room, and there, slouched against the couch, was their father, Jose, and their mother, Kitty. They had both been executed. Eric and Lyle are beside themselves. They call the police and they're in total hysterics, screaming for the officers to get there, that someone's killed their parents. The police show up, they go inside, and just based on the brutality of the injuries, Jose and Kitty had clearly been gunned down with shotguns and multiple blasts because pieces of them were missing. They were just totally destroyed. The police, because of that, assumed this has got to be a mob hit. There is some real aggression here. This is not an accident, this is a statement. The police immediately turned to Jose's business. He was the CEO of this very prominent media company. He had made millions and millions of dollars. He was very well connected, and they figured that somewhere in his dealings, there must have been a bad actor that was after him. And so for the first 6 months of the investigation, the focus was almost exclusively on Jose's business contacts. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric seemed to go totally crazy. They immediately inherited the $14 million family estate, and there was this huge cash payout right up front. And so the two of them go on this insane spending spree over those first 6 months. They bought condos on the water, they bought cars and Rolexes, they bought a chicken wing shop for $550,000. I mean, they were just buying things left and right. During their parents' funeral, Lyle was overheard talking about how he can't wait to go to the US Open, and look, I just bought a new Rolex. His mind was not on the fact that his parents had just been savagely murdered. It was on, what fun thing am I going to do with my money next? After the funeral, Eric decided he was going to put his energy into becoming a professional tennis player. So for $60,000, he hires a tennis player to live at his house and work with him every day on tennis, even though realistically, Eric was not a very good tennis player. But that was his focus. That's what he was going to work on. And Lyle spent most of his time building a team of people that could help him make investments into different companies in and around New York and New Jersey. But in addition to spending tons of money on their respective career interests, the brothers were also going to therapy sessions. And during one particular closed-door session, Eric would tell his therapist that me and my brother actually killed our parents. Eric clearly believed that he was able to talk to a therapist about anything and nothing would escape this room, that it was totally confidential. But what Eric wasn't planning for is the therapist's assistant was outside the doors walking by and overheard Eric say it. And she would tell the police would confront Eric as well as Lyle, and very quickly Eric and Lyle would confess. During their confession, they told investigators that on August 18th, they went out and purchased 2 shotguns and they stored them in their home. The next day, on August 19th, the brothers and their mom and dad go out on a fishing trip together the whole day. They come back, and then on August 20th, the 2 brothers retrieve their shotguns while the parents are sitting in the TV room, and they walk in and fire 15 shots into their parents, obliterating them. Afterwards, the brothers would ditch their shotguns and bloody clothes, and they would go to the movie theater and they would watch Batman. After the movie was over, they go back to the mansion, knowing exactly what they're going to find, and they go in and they put on this big performance. Oh my goodness, someone killed our parents! But it was all a lie, because they killed their parents for their money. Eric and Lyle were given life sentences and were sent to separate prisons, but actually just recently, they were reunited in the same jail. 30 years after their crime, a guy who collected NBA trading cards was rooting through some of his older cards, and he came across the Mark Jackson 1990 card. And he noticed in the background of the picture, sitting courtside, is none other than Eric and Lyle Menendez. It was during that 6-month crazy spending spree after they had murdered their parents, when they were going around buying up whatever they wanted, and they had bought courtside tickets to that particular game, and they happened to be immortalized on this playing card.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Privilege.
On the evening of Wednesday, May 21st, 1924, a man named Jacob Franks walked up the steps to his mansion, and right as he went to open his door, his butler opened it up, welcomed him inside, and Jacob smiled at the butler and stepped in. Jacob had just spent a long day at his office in Chicago, Illinois, doing a big real estate deal, and now he was just happy to be home with his wife and his 3 kids. Jacob was an incredibly successful business person who had made a name for himself first in the early 1900s when he ran a bank that specialized in giving out these enormous loans to gamblers. But it wasn't until he was named the president of the Rockford Watch Company and he expanded into real estate that he became outrageously wealthy. His fortune in today's dollars would have been around $70 million. But now that Jacob was so well established in the business world in Chicago, he was trying to make a more conscious effort to spend more time at home with his wife and kids. And so as soon as he walked past his butler into his mansion, he hung up his hat and his jacket, and he went to find his wife, Flora, to tell her about an idea he had for a trip for that upcoming weekend. But when Jacob found Flora, she was not remotely interested in talking about their weekend plans, because Flora was very worked up about their youngest son, Bobby. Bobby, who was 14 years old, was supposed to come home right after school, but it was now 6 p.m. and he still hadn't shown up, and she had no idea where he was. And Jacob's reaction to this news was just to feel kind of aggravated. Bobby was generally a really good kid. He was a student at a prestigious boys' school right down the road, and his teacher was convinced that Bobby was the smartest kid in his entire grade. Bobby was a member of the school's debate team and regularly beat the older kids, and Bobby was just a natural leader and very hardworking and kind. But Bobby could also be fairly irresponsible sometimes, specifically in terms of coming home on time. This was not the first time that Bobby had not come home by curfew. So Jacob told Flora, don't worry about it. This is something Bobby does. He likely lost track of time. And as Jacob and Flora are having this discussion, Bobby's older brother came into the room and suggested to his dad, Jacob, that perhaps Bobby was across the street at Richard's house. Richard was Bobby's cousin, playing tennis on their private court. Richard and Bobby were quite close, even though they were 4 years apart. Richard was 18, Bobby was 14, but they really bonded over tennis. And so that was something they did all the time. And so Jacob said he would go across the street and see if Bobby was there, and he also told his wife, Flora, to just continue to call around town and see if anybody knew where Bobby might be. And so Jacob left his mansion and began walking across the street towards Richard's family's mansion to see if his son was there. Now, this neighborhood that Jacob lived in was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods really in the entire country, but definitely within Chicago's city limits. It was called South Kenwood, and basically imagine a street where every house is a huge mansion, and every mansion is home to some business tycoon or famous person, and all the families who lived in this neighborhood had a full staff of maids and butlers and drivers and fleets of private cars. I mean, these people who lived in South Kenwood were literally the richest of the rich. And so Jacob, he gets across the street, he's standing in front of Richard's family's mansion, and he looks around the side, and he can see the private tennis court where his son and Richard would always play, but it's totally vacant, and in fact, the house is just totally quiet. No one's home. When Jacob got back to his own home, he found his wife pacing around in the parlor looking really concerned, and so Jacob immediately asked her, what'd you learn? What's going on? And she would tell Jacob that she had spoken to one of Bobby's friends who told her that Bobby had umpired a baseball game after school and had left to walk back home at around 5 p.m. The school and the baseball field where Bobby would have been was only about 3 blocks away from their home. And now it was 6:30 p.m. So it's been an hour and a half since Bobby had supposedly began his walk home. And so by now he certainly should be here, but of course he wasn't. At this point, Jacob went from feeling aggravated with his son to being concerned for his son's safety, despite the fact that he's thinking, okay, well, my son is likely somewhere in this neighborhood in South Kenwood, one of the safest, richest, best places in the country. He's got to be okay, but I really want to find him. And so Jacob would call one of his very close friends who lived in this neighborhood, who also happened to be a former state senator, and he asked him to come over and basically look around the neighborhood for Bobby. When the state senator friend arrived at Jacob's house, the two men left and began walking down this street lined with mansions, making their way towards the school where Bobby supposedly had been umpiring. And when they got there, they saw there was no baseball game happening, and the school was dark and closed for the night. But Jacob and his friend decided that, maybe it was possible that after umpiring this game, when Bobby had begun his walk home, maybe he had taken a detour into the school to get something, and then perhaps the doors got shut and locked on him. And so Jacob and his friend went to the school and looked for a way to basically break into the school. And sure enough, they would find an open window, they'd open it up, they would climb inside, and they would search the entire school, but Bobby was not in there. At this point, Jacob was really starting to panic. His friend was trying to calm him down, but Jacob is now thinking, something is terribly wrong with my son. And so the two men actually ran from the school back to Jacob's house, and when they went inside, Jacob immediately called out to his wife to see if maybe she had located Bobby, but when he called Flora's name, there was no response. And so Jacob and his friend, they run inside and they make their way towards the parlor, which is where they had last seen Flora before they left. And when they walked in there, they found Flora lying on the ground, totally lifeless, with the phone off the hook right next to her hand. And so Jacob and the senator, they run over and they begin shaking Flora, and suddenly she wakes up with a gasp, and she looks up at Jacob and just begins sobbing hysterically. And after Jacob finally calmed her down, she would tell him that after they had left to go to the school, she had received a phone call. And at first, she thought it was Bobby calling to check in. But when she answered it, it wasn't Bobby, it was a man's voice she didn't recognize, who told her that Bobby had been kidnapped. He was safe for now, but if they went to police, something terrible would happen to him. This mystery man also told Flora that they would be in touch soon with more information, and then they hung up. And Flora had been so overwhelmed by what she was told that she had fainted, and that was why they found her on the ground. That night, Jacob, Flora, and the state senator friend stayed up late going over, what they should do. Of course, they wanted to go to police, but this felt like a credible threat that Bobby could be harmed if they did that. And so they just went back and forth over how to handle this horrible situation. But by 2 a.m., they had made a decision. The state senator had some close friends and connections in the police department, and so they decided that they would go talk to the police, but they would swear them to secrecy so the kidnapper or kidnappers wouldn't know the police were investigating. And so, a few hours later, when the police department opened up, Jacob and the state senator friend went to the police, they spoke to the highest ranking officer who was sworn to secrecy, and then that morning, the police would begin a quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping. At the same time this investigation was beginning, on the morning of May 22nd, 1924, a man named Morton D. Ballard drove through downtown Chicago in a luxury car known as a Willis Knight. He pulled this luxury car into a parking lot right next to a rental car company, and after parking the car, Morton got out, he went inside of the shop, and he handed the keys over to the clerk behind the desk. The clerk would ask Morton, how did it go with your rental car? And Morton would say, oh, it was perfect, went totally fine. After that, Morton thanked the clerk, he turned around and walked outside where another luxury car was waiting for him, being driven by his good friend, Lewis Mason. And once Morton had climbed inside, the two men smiled and drove off and disappeared into traffic. That same morning, Jacob and Flora received a letter from the kidnapper or kidnappers demanding $10,000 in small unmarked bills, and if they gave this money over, they would get their son back. And immediately, Jacob went to the bank and got the money, but before he could actually deliver the money to the kidnappers at the location they had specified in this letter, the police, who were quietly investigating, discovered a clue that would break the case wide open. It would take over a week to unravel this bizarre clue, but it all started to come together when the police brought in Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason for questioning. Here is the shocking story that detectives were finally able to piece together about what happened to Bobby Franks. On May 7th, 1924, so 2 weeks before Bobby went missing, Morton D. Ballard walked into a hotel in Chicago called the Morrison and rented room 1031. He would tell the front desk that he wanted them to hold his mail for him, and over the next couple of days, Morton would come in and he would get his mail from the front desk, but he didn't appear to ever actually go up to his room. Finally, a suspicious maid at the Morrison Hotel, who had been going into room 1031 every day to clean it, only to discover that Morton was not in there and the room was totally untouched and clean already, she went in one morning and saw Morton was not in there, and she would actually just open up one of Morton's suitcases that he had left inside. And instead of the suitcase containing clothes or toiletries, it just contained a bunch of random library books. As it happened, after this maid found this strange suitcase full of books, Morton stopped coming to the hotel. He stopped getting his mail, he did not claim his luggage, and he didn't pay the bill. He just kind of vanished. On May 9th, so just a couple of days after Morton first booked that room at the Morrison Hotel, Morton also opened a bank account in Chicago. He also made his first appearance at that car rental company where he asked for the Willis Knight car. The rental company would not just let anybody take a Willis Knight car. You needed a reference to show that you were someone who could pay for this type of vehicle. And so Morton's friend, Lewis Mason, would give him that reference and allow him to rent the Willis Knight car. About a week and a half later, on May 21st, so the day Bobby went missing, Morton and Lewis were driving around South Kenwood in their Willis Knight car when they spotted Bobby by himself walking down the road. Now, Lewis recognized Bobby, and he knew that Bobby was an incredible tennis player, and Lewis had a question for Bobby about a particular tennis racket. And so Lewis, who was in the front seat of the car, told Morton, who was driving, to pull over so Lewis could talk to Bobby. And so Morton pulled over, Lewis rolled his window down, he called over to Bobby, Bobby came over, and before long, Lewis and Bobby were talking about this tennis racket, and then when that conversation naturally wrapped up, Lewis offered Bobby a ride the rest of the way home, because that was where Bobby was walking to when they stopped him. And so Lewis climbed into the back seat, Morton stayed in the driver's seat, and Bobby climbed inside and sat in the front seat. And then once those two were situated, Morton pulled away from the curb and began driving towards Bobby's house. And as they were driving to Bobby's house, Bobby just kind of continued talking about this tennis racket because that was the thing they were talking about. And as he was mid-sentence, Lewis from the backseat reached into his pocket, pulled out a chisel, and then lunged forward and began smashing Bobby in the back of the head over and over again with this chisel. And as Bobby is screaming in pain and trying to protect himself, Lewis lunges forward, grabs Bobby, drags him into the backseat, and then holds him down, pulls a rag out of his pocket, and jams it into Bobby's throat. And then he closes Bobby's mouth and holds it shut until Bobby goes still. After that, Lewis kind of grimaced at all of Bobby's blood all over him, and he kind of pushed Bobby down onto the floorboards below, and then Lewis calmly climbed back into the front seat and sat down, and meanwhile, Morton has not remotely reacted to what's just happened. This is just business as usual. Morton and Lewis did not go to Bobby's house, but instead drove towards Indiana. And on their drive to Indiana, they would stop at a roadside restaurant and eat hot dogs and root beers with their car parked right near this restaurant with Bobby's body just totally exposed laying out on the floorboards of the back seat. Morton and Lewis would eventually get into Indiana, and they would head to this particular forest that Morton was familiar with because he was a bird watcher and often came out here. And when they got to this forest, they parked in this clearing. They got out, they checked on Bobby and confirmed that he was dead, so they pulled him out, they stripped all of his clothes off of him, they rolled him up in a rug, and then they dragged him over to this drainage pipe that sat underneath some railroad tracks in this swampy area, and they jammed him inside of it. And then they got back in their car, they drove back to Chicago, at which point Morton called Bobby's mother, Flora, and informed her that her son was kidnapped, but alive, even though he wasn't, and don't call the police, we'll be in touch soon. That night, Morton and Lewis would burn all of the clothes they had stripped off of Bobby. They would also clean the interior of their Willis Knight rental car, and then they would play a game of cards together before going to bed. The next day, May 22nd, so the same day that police began their quiet investigation into Bobby's kidnapping, Morton and Lewis would send that letter to Jacob and Flora demanding $10,000 for the safe return of Bobby. But unfortunately, before Lewis and Morton could claim their ransom money, Bobby's body was discovered. In fact, that day he was discovered. A walker was cutting through the woods in Indiana and saw Bobby in the pipe. And so when Morton and Lewis realized that, the jig is up, the family's never going to pay for their son because he's dead, they just returned their Willis Knight rental car and went back to their normal lives as if nothing had ever happened. But unbeknownst to him, Morton had accidentally dropped his eyeglasses right next to Bobby's body when they dumped him in the woods in Indiana. And Morton's eyeglasses were very unique. In fact, there was only one store in the world that sold this particular kind of eyeglasses. And so when detectives got the call about Bobby's body being found, they would also find these glasses. And that was the big clue, because these glasses led detectives to the store where they were sold, and the owner of the store was able to say that, yep, those particular glasses were sold to Morton. And when detectives went to Morton, Morton immediately pointed the finger at Lewis, saying that Morton didn't do anything to Bobby, Lewis did. But about a week later, on May 31st, both Morton and Lewis would confess to police that they murdered Bobby. But far more shocking than what Morton and Lewis had done was who they were, because Morton and Lewis were not their real names. The two men who killed Bobby Franks were rich kids just like Bobby who lived in South Kenwood. They created two fake names, Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason, and then they booked room 1031 at the Morrison Hotel. Now, they had no intention of actually staying at this hotel, and so they just left that suitcase full of books inside of the room to make it appear like they were staying there. But in reality, the only reason they booked that room is they needed a physical mailing address that was connected to their fake personas. And so after booking this room, they began sending mail to Morton D. Ballard and Lewis Mason at the Morrison Hotel, room 1031. And then after collecting that mail, which served as a sort of proof of legal name and address, they were able to open a bank account in Chicago. They dumped some money into that. And then again, they used their proof of legal name and address to rent that Willis Knight car, and then used money from their phony bank account to pay for it. And then once they had their luxury car, it was time to go kill. In reality, Morton was actually a 19-year-old prodigy named Nathan Leopold. He spoke 5 languages, he had already graduated from college, and he was a nationally respected ornithologist, which is someone who studies birds. Nathan's IQ was so high, it literally couldn't be measured. His father was the president of a very successful steamship company, and Nathan was planning to attend Harvard University in the fall to get yet another college degree. And Lewis was actually 18-year-old Richard Loeb, who was Bobby's cousin and one of his best friends. Bobby and Richard played tennis together all the time in Richard's private court, which is where Bobby's father went first to go looking for his son. Like Nathan, Richard was also a genius. He was the youngest person ever to have graduated from the University of Michigan. He graduated at 17 years old. And to celebrate the occasion, Richard's father, who in today's dollars was worth about $175 million, he was a retired vice president for the major retail store Sears, he bought Richard a custom golf course. He built him his own golf course. That was his graduation present. And at the time of Bobby's murder, Richard was actually enrolled at the University of Chicago's law school, studying to become a lawyer. Nathan and Richard would very proudly tell investigators that they didn't kill Bobby to get money out of his parents. Nathan and Richard were fabulously wealthy. The money meant nothing. Instead, they had come up with this scheme and killed Bobby because of their belief in the philosopher Nietzsche's concept of supermen. Men whose superiority allows them to rise above all ordinary rules, ethics, and laws. Basically, Nathan and Richard believed they were so much better than everybody else in the world that if they wanted to kill someone, they should be able to. And Bobby seemed like a pretty easy target. After Nathan and Richard confessed, they were put under arrest, but a chauffeur was allowed to come to the police station and drop off silk pajamas for them to wear in custody, and instead of being held in a cell, they were allowed to stay in a hotel. But ultimately, they both were sentenced to life in prison. Bobby's family never recovered from his murder, and his father, Jacob, would die just 4 years after his son died. As for Nathan, he would be murdered in prison in 1936 by another inmate, and as for Richard, he would serve his time and get paroled, and then die of natural causes in 1971. Today, the murder of Bobby Franks is often referred to as the crime of the century.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is... On the evening of March 1st, 2018, 55-year-old Ted Shaughnessy placed a necklace in a glass display case in his high-end jewelry store in Austin, Texas. Ted adjusted his glasses on his face and then leaned in a bit closer, and he saw the lights in the case bounce off the gold and jewels in this necklace, and it was so beautiful, he just smiled. He and his wife Corey had owned this jewelry store for 20 years. Corey had a keen eye for jewelry, so she worked as the appraiser, choosing which pieces to buy and then sell inside of the store, and also determining how much they were worth. And Ted was a great salesman. Ted took pride in the way he displayed the jewelry in the store. He wanted to draw the customers in, and then once they were there, Ted would approach them like they were lifelong friends. Now, part of the reason he did this was just because it was an effective sales tactic. But also, Ted really did love meeting and talking with people who came in to shop off the street. That's actually one of the reasons he'd worked in retail for most of his adult life. Ted locked the display case and walked around the shop, turning off lights and closing things up for the day. Then he set the security alarm, headed out the door, and locked it behind him. Some nights, Ted would stay at the jewelry store long after it had closed to go over the books or to redo the displays. But tonight, he wanted to get home as quickly as he could. He and his wife had plans to spend the entire night doing one of their favorite things, eating a great home-cooked meal together and just relaxing and watching TV. After leaving the store, Ted climbed into his car and headed home. About 25 minutes later, he pulled into his neighborhood and he looked around at all the huge houses with sprawling front yards and swimming pools out back. He found his house, which was just as big as all the others, and he pulled into the long driveway and came to a stop. He got out of the car, walked inside his house through the front door, and the moment he was inside, he was hit with this wonderful smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. But before he could even call out to his wife, he heard loud clacking sounds on the hardwood floors as two large dogs bounded through the front room towards him. Ted enthusiastically knelt down and began goofing around with the dogs and asking them how they were doing, like they could answer back. Then he stood back up, and the dogs followed at his heels as Ted made his way through the house, which could feel like walking through a maze for somebody who had never been there. Ted and the dogs got to the kitchen, and Ted saw his wife Corey standing over the stove. Corey turned around, and Ted immediately walked over, put his hands on her waist, and gave her a kiss. Ted helped his wife put some finishing touches on the meal, and then they both got excited about the night ahead of them. They knew a lot of people would find this to be a pretty boring way to spend the night, but Ted and Corey really were never happier than when they were just hanging out together. After the food was finally done cooking, the couple sat down and ate their great meal at the dining room table, while their dogs just stared at them, hoping for some scraps. After they were all done eating,
Ted cleared the table and took the dishes into the kitchen. One of the dogs, a Rottweiler named Bart, followed him every step of the way. After Ted rinsed off the dishes, he joined his wife on the couch in the front room. He draped his arm around her shoulder, and she leaned her head on his chest as they began to watch TV. They spent the night flipping between channels, really only half paying attention. Most of the time, they just talked about things at the jewelry store, and also how their son and his girlfriend seemed to be getting pretty serious. Even though their 19-year-old son only lived about 2 hours away in College Station, Texas, and they saw him often, it still felt strange to be empty nesters, not to have him in the house anymore. Before they knew it, they had spent hours just sitting there talking, and they'd both begun to feel tired. So Ted flipped off the TV, and the couple headed to their bedroom, with both of their trusty dogs trotting along right behind them. A little before 4:45 a.m. on March 2nd, 2018, so several hours after Ted and Corey had gone to bed, they both suddenly woke up to the sound of their dogs barking in their room. Ted flipped on the light on his bedside table, and he and his wife looked over and saw their dogs barking away, standing right by the bedroom door. Ted tried to get them to calm down, but they just kept on barking over and over again. Ted could see his wife looked frightened, and he was feeling a bit freaked out too. The dogs were both really good guard dogs, and they usually only got agitated when they'd heard something. And so Ted slowly got out of bed, opened the drawer on the bedside table, and pulled out a .45 caliber handgun. He checked to make sure it was loaded, and then told his wife to stay in the room. Ted walked over to the door, opened it up, and headed outside. He made his way into the dark kitchen, and Bart the Rottweiler followed right behind. Just a few minutes later, Corey threw open her closet door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut behind her. She crouched down in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible, and as she sat there panting, out of breath, she clutched her phone in one hand, and in the other hand, she was holding a .357 caliber revolver. She dialed 911 on her phone and pressed it to her ear, and at the same time, she held the gun out in front of her, aimed at the closet door in case anybody approached her. She heard the sound of the emergency operator on the other line, and she said the police needed to get to her house right away. Multiple gunshots had been fired, she didn't know if her husband was even alive at this point, and she said she was sure she would be dead within seconds. "15 minutes later, so just after 5 a.m., Travis County homicide detectives James Moore and Paul Salo headed up the long walkway toward Ted and Corey's front door. By this point, crime scene tape had already been stretched across the large property, several uniformed police officers stood on the lawn, and 2 officers stood near the front door with Corey, who was there in her nightgown, sobbing. Detectives Moore and Salo introduced themselves to Corey and told her they'd be back to her shortly. Then they put on their gloves and headed inside of her house. Just standing in the front room, both detectives got a sense of how big this house was, and how many different hallways and paths there were to take. They made their way through the front room and walked into the kitchen, where a team of forensics officers were already searching for evidence. On the floor, sprawled out under the kitchen table, the detectives saw Ted Shaughnessy's body. Blood covered his face and his chest. But the detectives also saw something that completely threw them off. Because in the call they got, they'd already been told about Ted being deceased. But they didn't expect to also see his pet dog lying right there with him. Bart, the Rottweiler, had clearly been shot and killed, laying just a few feet in front of Ted, like he'd been trying to maybe protect him. One of the forensics officers joined Detectives Moore and Salo and pointed out multiple bullet casings littering the kitchen floor. In fact, there were so many casings that the detectives thought it looked like a massive shootout had taken place right there in the kitchen. The detectives walked over to the kitchen table and knelt down by Ted's body. Near his outstretched hand, they saw a .45 caliber handgun. Moore checked the magazine and saw it was full, so it appeared like Ted had not fired a single shot from his weapon. However, Moore asked the forensics officer if there was any chance that Ted maybe did fire off some shots and actually emptied out a magazine and then reloaded. and then once it was reloaded, maybe he didn't fire again, giving the impression he had not shot at all. Now, Moore didn't think this was likely, but he just wanted to be sure. The forensics officer told him they were still looking at everything, but so far, none of the casings they'd found matched the caliber of Ted's gun. So very likely Ted did not fire a single shot. After spending some time searching the kitchen and also studying Ted's wounds, Moore and Salo began to make their way through the rest of the house. They found a home security system that was not armed, and they didn't find any evidence of forced entry at the front, back, or side doors. They thought maybe whoever had killed Ted had been invited inside the home, or at the very least had a key. However, as soon as they stepped into one of the bedrooms, they immediately began to rethink that theory. Based on the way the room was decorated, it appeared to belong to a young man. But more importantly, when they looked inside this room, they could see that one of the windows was open, and the window screen had been removed and dropped down onto the ground just outside. Moore and Salo went back to the kitchen and told the forensics officers what they just found. And as members of the forensics team headed to that bedroom, the detectives made their way to the front of the house and walked outside. They saw Ted's wife, Corey, still standing with the two officers. They approached her and gently asked if she was up to answering a few questions. Corey wiped some tears away from her face, but then nodded and said she was. And so Detective Salo asked her if she could just walk them through what had happened that morning. Corey said that she and her husband had woken up sometime around 4:45 a.m. when they heard their dogs barking. Ted had grabbed his gun and walked out with one of the dogs, while she had stayed back in the bedroom with the other dog. But then she said she heard gunshots coming from the kitchen, so she grabbed her own gun and ran out of the bedroom. She could hear her husband screaming, but there was also this bright light shining directly at her, making it really hard to see. All she could see were shadows moving around in front of her. But then she saw one of these shadows fire a gun and kill one of their dogs, and so instinctively she raised her own gun and unloaded her weapon, trying to hit the shadow. Detective Salo asked her what kind of weapon she had, and Corey said she had a .357 revolver. Salo and Moore looked at each other, but didn't say anything. Corey had just admitted she fired her weapon inside the house, and they've just found her husband dead from gunshots. So either she was lying and was making this whole thing up about shadows to cover up her part in the crime, or this really happened. Detective Moore asked Corey if one of the bedrooms in the house belonged to a young man. Corey said they must mean her son's room. She said she still had his room, but he was 19 years old now and lived a couple of hours away with his girlfriend. And she'd already asked an officer to call them right after police had arrived, and they were on their way right now. Detective Salo asked Corey if she could give any description of the person she'd fired her gun at, even though it was dark and shadowy. Corey shook her head and said no. She figured it was just a burglar. After all, she and Ted were well known in the area for their jewelry store and for having made a good amount of money. And so they knew they were a target for robbery. After this, Salo and Moore stepped away from Corey and headed back inside the house. And already they were starting to question some of Corey's answers. Like most spouses in murder cases, Corey was immediately considered a suspect, and the fact that her weapon had been fired in the house only made her a stronger one. On top of that, when she called 911, she said she was hiding in the closet, and she was sure whoever was inside her house was coming for her. But when the police had arrived and done a sweep of the house, nobody was there. Finally, Corey had just claimed that she thought this was all a robbery gone bad. However, the detectives had walked through the house and seen stacks of cash, high-end jewelry, and expensive electronics just laying out, untouched. And Corey and Ted's safe did not look like anyone had even tried to break into it. So why would a robber leave without taking a single thing of value? Still, the son's bedroom window had been opened, and so if Corey had done that to try to stage things to make it look like a break-in and robbery, she didn't do anything else to the house to back that up. The detectives talked this over as they went back to the son's bedroom, and when they walked in, one of the forensics officers had a smile on his face, and he said they had just pulled a really clear fingerprint off the outside of the window, so they hoped that would lead them right to the person who had climbed in. And as Moore and Salo stood there, something began to hit them. If somebody did really break into the house through this window, climb into this bedroom, and then make their way all the way to the kitchen, they would almost have to have some previous knowledge of the layout of this place. Because even with all the lights on, this was not an easy house to navigate. It was massive and basically like a big labyrinth. So now, the detectives felt almost convinced that even if Ted's wife was not involved, somebody who Ted knew and who had very likely been to this particular house many times must have been his killer. A couple hours later, at 8 a.m. on March 2nd, a car pulled up in front of the house. Ted's 19-year-old son, Nicholas, and Nicholas's girlfriend, Jackie Edison, parked behind the line of police cars outside the house that Nicholas had grown up inside of. They both got out of the car and immediately spotted Corey, who was still standing in the front yard, and began running towards her. An officer stopped them, but when they said who they were, he let them by. A moment later, Nicholas and Jackie were hugging Corey, and all three of them just stood there crying. Inside the house, Detectives Moore and Salo got word that Ted's son had just arrived. So they quickly went outside and found Nicholas and Jackie still standing with Corey. The detectives apologized for interrupting, but they asked Nicholas if they could talk to him for a few minutes. Nicholas said of course, and then followed the detectives across the yard to a spot where they'd be able to talk without anybody else hearing. Moore started off by asking Nicholas where he'd been around 4:45 a.m. that morning, the time the 911 call had come in, and Nicholas said that he and his girlfriend were asleep at their place in College Station. Jackie was a student at Texas A&M down there, and Nicholas worked trading stocks as a day trader. Moore took down a few notes, and then asked Nicholas if there was anyone he could think of who had a problem with his father and might have wanted to do this. But Nicholas shook his head and said basically everybody who knew his parents loved them. Moore asked if there was anything at all about Nicholas's dad that he could think of that could maybe help them, even if it was really small. Nicholas thought about it for a few seconds, and then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he just remembered something. He said there was one thing that could be important, but it was a really weird situation. When he'd still been living at home, his next-door neighbor had come to him and said she thought that her husband was cheating on her. This neighbor knew Nicholas was pretty good with technology, so she'd asked if there was any way he could track her husband or something, and she told him she would pay him for his services. Nicholas had felt strange getting involved in something like this, but his next-door neighbor was a nice woman and a good friend of his mother's, so he had helped her. He had put a tracker on her husband's car and followed him one night to another woman's house, and it became clear pretty quickly that the man was cheating on his wife. Now, Nicholas got a worried look on his face. He'd always assumed the husband never knew he was involved in helping the wife catch him cheating. But if this man had found out it was him, he might have wanted revenge, and his dad might be dead because of it. After that, the detectives told Nicholas he could go rejoin his mother. After he had walked off, the two men just looked at each other and shook their heads in disbelief. That was a really weird story. Neither of them had ever run into a teenager who had acted like a private investigator to catch a cheating husband. It almost sounded made up, or like something the kid might have watched on TV. But regardless, it was a good lead. After Moore and Salo finished up their initial work at Ted and Corey's house, they walked next door to the neighbor's house. They knocked on the front door, and a woman answered, and quickly she invited them inside. They all sat down at her kitchen table, and the detectives didn't waste any time. They needed to know if Nicholas's wild story about trailing this woman's husband was true. The woman looked a little embarrassed, but she said Nicholas was telling the truth. She felt bad for dragging a teenager into her marital problems, but she had been desperate. Detective Moore leaned in and told her he did not need all the details about her marriage, but he needed to know one thing. It was extremely important. Had she ever told her husband about Nicholas's involvement in all of this? The woman didn't hesitate. She said no way would she ever do that. Her husband, who had since moved away and was soon to be her ex-husband, had no idea at all about Nicholas. And as she was talking, the reason for this line of questioning finally dawned on her. And she stopped and just said her husband might have cheated on her, but there was no way he would have ever attacked Ted or anybody else like that. The detectives left the house not long after that and headed back to the station. Despite what the woman said about her husband, they knew they still had to track him down and get more information directly from him. In the days following the murder, while members of their investigative team followed up on the neighbor's husband, Moore and Salo contacted Ted's closest friends to see what else they could learn about him. But not much new came from that. Everybody seemed to like Ted, and nobody could understand who would do this unless it was a robbery. Now, while the detectives still were not convinced Ted's death was the result of a robbery gone wrong, they did start to look more into the jewelry store to see if maybe somebody had been staking the place out and following Ted home. However, they got a phone call from Ted's son, Nicholas, that caused them to quickly change the direction of their investigation. Nicholas was aware that his bedroom window had been found open on the night his father was killed, and he said he just couldn't stop thinking about it, and in fact, there was something he felt like he needed to share with the detectives. He told them when he was younger, he would use his bedroom window to sneak out of the house and then get back inside without his parents knowing. It was just stupid teenager stuff, nothing serious, but he did it so often that he made a habit of just keeping that window unlocked. Now he realized that particular window might have been left unlocked even after he had moved out. But what Nicholas said was really weighing on him was that there was only really one other person who knew he did this with his window, and that was his friend Spencer Patterson. Because he and Spencer had crept out of that window a bunch of times together when Spencer had slept over. Detective Salo asked Nicholas if the reason he was so worried was because maybe Spencer had some reason to come after Nicholas now? Like had they had a bad fight or something? Nicholas said no, but he said Spencer would have gone to their house and potentially used that window to get in there and get his parents' money and jewels. Nicholas said Spencer had not really grown up with money of his own, and he'd always been kind of jealous of how wealthy Nicholas's family was. And there was more. Spencer not only knew about the bedroom window, he also knew exactly where to find Nicholas's parents' safe. About a week after the murder, Detectives Salo and Moore sat together in an office, going over the notes they'd already put together. And even though their investigation was still relatively new, they felt like they had some promising leads. They still thought there was a strong chance that Corey had simply shot her husband, because in addition to what they'd learned at the house, they'd now discovered that Corey was the beneficiary of Ted's $1 million life insurance policy. She also stood to gain sole ownership of the jewelry store and the house, which were both worth a ton of money too. The detectives believed they'd have a clear idea about Corey's potential involvement in the murder when they got the results of the ballistics tests that would show if Corey's gun had fired the bullets that killed Ted. But the detectives had also started to consider that maybe Corey had been right. Maybe this was a robbery gone bad. And if that was the case, Nicholas's friend Spencer had to be high on their suspect list. Even if this robbery had not actually been successful, Spencer did know that Ted and Corey were wealthy, he knew how to sneak in through Nicholas's window, he knew his way around the maze-like house, and he knew where the safe was. Detective Moore picked up the phone, put it on speaker, and called the number he had for Spencer. Spencer picked up, and Moore quickly introduced himself and then immediately launched into a series of questions. The detectives learned that Spencer had gone over to Ted and Corey's house for dinner about a month ago when Nicholas had been visiting. And they said that they had treated him like he was one of the family, just like they'd done since he was a kid. Moore asked Spencer how he and Nicholas used to sneak out of the house when they were younger. And Spencer talked about using the bedroom window, just like Nicholas had said. While the detectives talked to Spencer, they kept getting the feeling like he was holding something back. The kid was being very cooperative and answering their questions, but there just seemed like there was always this hesitation, or like he was about to say something and then chose not to. By the end of the call, Moore and Salo still did not feel satisfied, so they scheduled an in-person meeting with Spencer. And in the meantime, they decided to keep a close eye on their other major suspect. About a week later, in late March, Nicholas and Jackie were sitting on the couch in the front room of Ted and Corey's house, looking at Corey as she stared out the window onto the street. Nicholas didn't want his mom to be alone, so he told her that he and Jackie would stay at the house as long as they needed to. That had cheered Corey up, but it was clear she was still struggling. And today, Nicholas and Jackie were extra worried about her, because she kept standing there just staring out the window. They had no idea why. But suddenly, Corey turned around and told them to come over and take a look for themselves. And so Nicholas and Jackie walked over to the window, and Corey pointed to a plain-looking sedan on the street. She told them she thought it was a cop and that he was watching her. At first, this seemed like paranoia to Nicholas and Jackie. However, when Nicholas looked out the window and he got a good look at that car before it drove off, he thought his mom was right. It definitely could be an unmarked police car. Corey stepped away from the window and collapsed onto the couch. She didn't understand why the police would be watching her. Why weren't they out finding the person who had actually killed her husband? Nicholas looked over at his mom, and he could tell she was just in total despair. And so he leaned over to Jackie and whispered something in her ear. Jackie was surprised by what she just heard, but she quickly smiled and nodded her head. And so Nicholas took Jackie's hand, and together they walked over to the couch where Corey was. And then Nicholas took a breath and said that he and Jackie had something very important he wanted to tell her. They were not just boyfriend and girlfriend anymore, they had actually gotten married. Corey instantly sat up and just stared at them for a second, shocked. Nicholas quickly said that they had planned to tell her and Dad when they came to visit next, and they still wanted to have a big ceremony, but they had just decided they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together, and so they had just gotten it done and gotten married. After a tense couple of seconds, Corey broke down in tears, but these were tears of joy. She got off the couch, smiled, and hugged Jackie, and told her how happy she was to welcome her to the family. Then Corey said Jackie should go pick an engagement ring from their jewelry shop, and then they should have a big engagement party. Even if they were already married, she didn't want her to miss out on anything. And who knows, maybe this was a way for them to start to heal a bit and move forward as a family. Nicholas was very relieved. He was so glad the news had made his mom as happy as he hoped it would. But as excited as she seemed, and as much as they all wanted something to celebrate during this terrible time, Nicholas just couldn't shake the image of that unmarked police car staking out his mother's house. Over the following weeks, the investigative team continued to dig into the Shaughnessy's financial records, and they also did keep eyes on Corey's house. While that was going on, Detectives Moore and Salo met in person with Nicholas's friend Spencer. And somehow, being face-to-face with him made them feel even more like he was hiding something. And it was strange, because on the surface, Spencer seemed cooperative and like he wanted to help. But there was just something about the way this kid spoke that convinced Moore and Salo that they couldn't fully trust him. So, after meeting with Spencer at the station, the detectives secured warrants to search Spencer's house and his car. Now, the search of the house didn't turn up anything out of the ordinary. However, when they went through Spencer's car, they found a .380 caliber gun. Spencer had never mentioned having this gun, which seemed a little odd since he knew he was being investigated for a shooting. The detectives thought if he had wanted to clear himself, he wouldn't try to hide the fact that he owned a gun. And within days, this new piece of evidence looked a lot more damning, because when ballistics reports came back, they showed that some of the bullets fired at the crime scene came from a .357, which matched Corey's gun, and some of the others came from a .380, just like Spencer's. About a month after Ted's murder, Detectives Moore and Salo believed they had Ted's killer in their sights. They collected more financial records and cell phone data to try to tie up any loose ends, and then they brought Spencer into the station for one last interview. Spencer sat down at a small table across from Salo and Moore in a brightly lit, cramped room. He'd always seemed a bit nervous to the detectives, but today, he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But despite that, Moore and Salo didn't go on the attack. Spencer was young, and he was nervous and scared. So, Moore tried to put him at ease. He told him they thought they knew what happened on the morning Ted died. They just needed Spencer to help them fill in the blanks. And before Spencer could even begin to talk, the detectives confronted him with all the evidence they had in the case. And so they told him there really wasn't any point trying to hide anything anymore. After a very tense minute, Spencer looked across the table at the detectives and then told them everything he knew. Following that interview, it would take Moore and Salo several more weeks to nail everything down. But in May of 2018, 2 months after Ted's murder, They knew exactly what had happened and who had fired the shots that killed Ted Shaughnessy. Based on Spencer's interview, cell phone data, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Ted in the early morning hours of March 2nd, 2018. On that morning, the killers crept through the dark house, led only by the light shining from one of their phones. They each held a gun in their hands, and they tried to move as slowly and quietly as possible. But when they made it to the kitchen and turned towards the main bedroom, they heard dogs start barking. The killers froze, not sure what to do. One of the dogs sounded really aggressive. The killer holding the phone shined the light towards the bedroom door, and right away they both saw something moving towards them. As the barking got louder and they heard footsteps and loud clacking on the wooden floors, suddenly the light illuminated the dog, and it was the Rottweiler Bart, bounding towards them, baring his teeth. One of the killers instinctively raised their gun and fired off a shot. The dog squealed and fell to the kitchen floor. Ted screamed and ran into the kitchen after the dog. He raised his gun, but before he could get a shot off, now both killers started firing. The sound of gunshots crashed through the house as bullets hit Ted in the back, the thigh, and the head. Ted collapsed to the floor under the kitchen table, dead. The killers began shouting at each other, starting to panic. This had not gone the way it was supposed to. But before they could make another move, bullets came whizzing out of the dark into the kitchen, hitting the wall and sending pieces of plaster onto the floor. The killer with the cell phone shined the light in the direction of the gunshots, trying to get a clear look at the shooter. Their hands were shaking and they couldn't really aim well, but still the killers just held their guns and started firing wildly. And then finally, the shots stopped and the kitchen fell silent. One of the killers shouted that they needed to get out of there, so they ran out of the kitchen into one of the bedrooms and climbed out the open window. Outside, they ran as fast as they could through the darkness back to a car they'd parked down the street. They got in, and one of the killers hit the gas and floored it through the neighborhood while the other killer sat panicking in the passenger seat. They both knew they had screwed up, and now they were going to have to get in touch with the people who had hired them and tell them they'd only taken out one of the intended targets. The killers were two men who had no connection to Ted. However, the two people who hired these men were Ted's own son, Nicholas, and the woman Nicholas had secretly married, Jackie Edison. Nicholas knew if both of his parents were dead, he would inherit their store and their house and benefit from their life insurance policies, all of which would have made him a multimillionaire. And Nicholas really wanted that money, because he had gone into quite a bit of debt from playing the stock market as a day trader. So, with Jackie's help, he found two hitmen and offered to pay them a lot of money to kill both Ted and Corey and to make it look like a robbery. Nicholas told the hitmen about his bedroom window and gave them a complete layout of the house. But on the night of the murder, the hitmen did not imagine they would find themselves in a full-fledged shootout, so when Corey started firing off her .357 at them, the whole plan fell apart. And so when Corey rushed back to her closet to call 911, instead of the hitmen going after her and killing her, they just ran out of the house and didn't even attempt to make it look like a robbery. And then a few hours later, when Nicholas and Jackie arrived at the house, they knew their plan had not worked. So they tried to play the perfect son and daughter-in-law. Nicholas also sent the cops after the neighbor's husband and his close friend Spencer. The neighbor's husband was cleared as a suspect very quickly, but Spencer remained high on the suspect list, just like Corey was, for a significant amount of time. However, when ballistics tests came back, they confirmed that none of the bullets fired from Corey's gun had actually struck Ted, and that the gun that was found in Spencer's car had not been used in the murder. And that fingerprint that had been found on the bedroom window did not match Spencer's. In fact, it just turned out to be an old print from when the window had been manufactured. So the detectives no longer believed Spencer committed the murder, and the more they talked to Spencer, the more they realized he wasn't hiding something to protect himself. He was hiding something to protect his best friend, Nicholas. But in his final meeting with police, Spencer would admit that Nicholas had talked to him on several occasions about wanting to murder his parents and hiring hitmen to do it. And after this, when police dug deeper into Nicholas's phone records, they found a couple of things that sealed the case. Nicholas, being the family member who was the most tech-savvy, set up an app on his phone that enabled him to control the alarm system on his parents' house. And the second discovery, and the far more damning one, was a series of text messages between Nicholas and Jackie in which the two of them were clearly arranging a murder for hire. Nicholas and both shooters were sentenced to 35 years in prison. Jackie cut a plea deal and received 10 years of probation, but with one very specific caveat. She had to spend 2 nights in jail every year on the anniversary of Ted's murder. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On a cold fall morning in 1999, 51-year-old Martin Henry walked across the linoleum flooring at the Glister Mary Lee popcorn plant in Jasper, Missouri. The fluorescent lights overhead glinted on all the stainless steel machinery that covered the manufacturing floor. Workers bustled around their stations, already hard at work despite the early hour. A young man followed behind Martin as he walked the plant floor. He was a new hire, and he was taking notes as Martin pointed at different machines and explained how they worked. He gestured at the dozens of employees working all around the room and jokingly told the new guy that he should try to meet everybody. The new guy just started laughing. That's because the new guy knew everybody here already. Jasper was a town of just 1,000 people, and the popcorn factory employed about 15% of them. Martin had instantly recognized the new guy from around town the moment he had showed up that day. Martin led the new hire over to the workstation that he knew best, the mixer room where he had worked for most of the past 2 years. Martin manned the machine that coated each popcorn kernel with buttery flavoring. He liked to think of himself as the guy who made the popcorn taste just like it did at the movies. Martin took a keyring out of his pocket and turned on the mixing machines. A moment later, a puff of yellow mist leaked out of the top of the largest mixer, and right away this wonderful buttery scent filled the air. Martin peeled off his rubber gloves and grabbed a new pair. Then he showed the new guy how to work all the different buttons and toggles in the mixing room and what the different level readings meant. Then he pressed a few buttons, and the machine hummed into action. Martin stepped aside and told his new trainee to give the mixers a try. So the young man turned on the spigot on one of the 2 smaller mixing tanks, letting butter flavoring pour out into a plastic 5-gallon bucket. As Martin stood there with his hands on his hips, he felt proud of his work. But he also felt distracted because his arms felt so dry and itchy. They had been that way all week, something he blamed on the changing weather. He was glad that his thick rubber gloves and long-sleeved white coat prevented him from scratching. Otherwise, he feared he might scratch himself bloody. But after only a few minutes of standing there, Martin just couldn't stand the itching any longer. So he excused himself from the new hire and then hustled over to the locker room where he could scratch himself to his heart's content and douse himself in more lotion. A few months later, Martin's wife, Linda Henry, rolled out of bed and began walking over to the bathroom she shared with her husband. As she did, she heard her husband moving, and she turned and saw him roll over in bed and reach for the phone on the nightstand. To protect his skin, Martin's hands were actually wrapped in plastic bags, which crinkled as he punched in the phone number he was trying to press. He was calling into work, letting them know he needed a sick day to deal with his ongoing skin problem. She heard him say that the pain was unbearable, which to her seemed like an understatement. Linda walked into the bathroom and opened up the medicine cabinet and grabbed a half-empty jar of Vaseline. For the past few weeks, her husband's hands had been so chapped and flaky that Linda had been coating them in Vaseline and then wrapping them in those plastic bags while he slept, both to prevent scratching and to keep his skin from falling off onto their sheets. For the past couple of weeks, the skin on Martin's hands and legs had gotten so papery and ashen that it had started falling off in 2 to 3 inch chunks. Now, historically, Martin did typically get dry hands in the winter, but it had never gotten this bad before. Linda couldn't imagine what might be causing this severe skin condition, but she was very worried about her husband. He seemed to always be in pain. At first, she blamed his job at the factory. Constant hand washing and changing rubber gloves and cleaning the machines with harsh chemicals couldn't be doing him any favors. But Martin assured her that none of his symptoms got worse while he was at work, and they didn't improve while he was home. Besides, none of the other employees had developed skin conditions. Now, Martin's reasoning made enough sense, but now, as Linda helped Martin remove the bags from his Vaseline-covered hands, it was clear, at least to her, that something was terribly wrong here, and almost certainly it had to do with his job. I mean, what else could it be? And so after saying as much to her husband, Martin finally relented and said that he would file for workers' compensation insurance, claiming he had developed the skin disease from work. 2 months later, Linda was just about to start making dinner when she heard the mail fall through the slot in their front door. Her eyes widened when she saw it was an envelope from the factory's insurance company. She hoped it was good news about her husband's workers' compensation. She carried the envelope into the living room where Martin was sitting back in his easy chair. His hands were covered in bloody red patches where his skin had fallen off. But now, Martin had more to worry about than just a skin disease. Over the past few weeks, Martin had also developed severe difficulty breathing, which really frightened Linda. He'd gone to the doctor, but the doctor said very likely his shortness of breath was unconnected to whatever was going on with his dry skin. The doctor said his breathing issue seemed like a standard case of bronchitis, or maybe he'd developed asthma. But none of the medicines the doctor prescribed for these conditions had helped Martin's breathing. And so Martin spent most days coughing and wheezing, and sometimes even gasping for air. He could barely get up the stairs to their bedroom at night. The recliner was the only place he felt somewhat comfortable. When Linda entered the room, she could see her husband was asleep in the chair. She could hear his soft wheezing. But she felt like this envelope was worth waking him up for. They really needed some good news, and this could be it. So she walked over and tapped gently on her husband's shoulder, and he opened his eyes and immediately just began hacking and coughing, as always. Linda handed him the letter, and when he saw what it was, his eyes went wide. He was eager to see what it would say. By this point, because of Martin's medical issues, he basically didn't leave the house anymore. And he hadn't gone back to work ever since that day he called in sick 2 months earlier. And he and his wife were just at a loss. They couldn't understand how Martin, a seemingly healthy 51-year-old man, could become this sick so quickly. And out of the two of them, Linda was also very convinced that whatever was going on with him really did have to do with his job. It had to be the cause. Also, by now, rumors were starting to spread that other workers at the factory had also become ill. Although they didn't seem as bad off as Martin, their symptoms were similar: wheezing cough, trouble breathing, and this horrible skin rash. And so as Linda watched her now very frail husband open up this envelope, causing bits of his skin to flake off and fall to the carpet, she hoped the other men from the factory would also apply for workers' compensation too, because clearly something was terribly wrong at that factory. Linda watched Martin take the sheet of paper out of the envelope and read it over. Then Martin cursed and told her bitterly that his workers' compensation claim had been denied. The company's doctor had evaluated Martin before his breathing problems started, and so the only thing he had been evaluated for was his skin condition. And there wasn't enough evidence to prove his dry, flaking skin was caused by conditions at the factory. And so if Martin and Linda were going to get some financial help, it would have to come from somewhere else. A few weeks later, in April of 2000, Dr. Thomas Carter reviewed some paperwork at his desk in Kansas City, Missouri. Dr. Carter was an occupational health physician, and he'd been alerted to the strange medical cases coming out of the popcorn plant in Joplin. Over the past few weeks, Dr. Carter had interviewed Martin, along with 7 other popcorn factory workers, all of them struggling to breathe and suffering rashes all over their bodies. He now had medical records for all 8 workers, and the details had shocked him. All 8 had been given different diagnoses, like asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema, but their symptoms were almost identical. All 8 men were struggling to get air into their lungs, and medication had been ineffective in treating their symptoms. One of the workers was 44 years old, but his lung capacity had been reduced to that of a small child. Given all the evidence, Dr. Carter had drawn a chilling conclusion. In his opinion, Martin and the 7 other workers had a rare but often fatal lung disease called bronchiolitis obliterans, which literally meant the obliteration of the lungs' airways. Most people with this condition die within 5 years as their airways become increasingly inflamed and then scarred, making breathing extremely difficult. It can also cause the painful skin condition Martin was experiencing, although many doctors don't make the connection. And so while Martin and his co-workers were grateful to now have this information about what was happening to their bodies, at the same time, they were devastated. This condition they had was irreversible, and unless they got a lung transplant, they would die. In all of Dr. Carter's 25-year career, he'd only ever seen this disease 3 times. And now, there were 8 cases in a single town of only 1,000 people, and all 8 of those people worked at the same factory. Those were epidemic-level numbers. And so Dr. Carter picked up the phone and called the Missouri Department of Health and Human Services. 6 months later, in November of 2000, Dr. Rebecca Roberts stood on the factory floor at the popcorn plant, watching several factory workers breathe into small plastic devices called spirometers. Dr. Roberts had flown into Jasper the night before from Washington, D.C. She worked at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and this popcorn facility had been on her radar for a while now. Over the summer, Dr. Roberts and her team had learned about the 8 factory workers who had developed the terrible respiratory disease called bronchiolitis obliterans. She also knew that investigators from another agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, had inspected the popcorn facility. But the OSHA investigators didn't find any health or safety violations. But despite their findings, Dr. Roberts just couldn't get around the idea that there had to be some connection to this factory. I mean, the idea that 8 workers all at the same plant all developed the same rare lung disease, it couldn't be coincidence. So that August and September, she had personally conducted 2 walkthrough investigations of the popcorn plant. Now, during those visits, Dr. Roberts had not spotted any obvious red flags. But she still was not convinced that this factory was safe. So she had decided to return to the factory one more time, and this time she brought a medical team to do a more detailed survey. Today, her team was interviewing workers at the factory and using these spirometers to measure their breathing. While Dr. Roberts' team talked to workers on the main factory floor, she turned her attention to the mixing room, where Martin once worked. There was only one man in the mixing room, moving buckets of butter flavoring from one vat to another. When Dr. Roberts introduced herself, he shook her hand and said that his name was Simon. Then he began to cough into the crook of his elbow, and as he did, he kind of shook his head, cursing under his breath. Dr. Roberts asked him if he was coming down with something. Simon told her he'd had a cough for a while now. He laughed and said it actually helped him fit in, because pretty much everybody who worked in the mixing and packaging rooms had asthma or bronchitis or something like that, and so everybody was coughing all the time. After this short conversation, Dr. Roberts climbed up a nearby metal staircase to the mezzanine, which looked out over the mixing room. There were a few men working there, and she quickly waved them over. A tall guy with a hairnet came over first, and Dr. Roberts asked him if he had breathing problems too. The man nodded and said the doctors diagnosed him with asthma. He said he developed it over the past year, but for whatever reason, asthma medications did not seem to help at all. By the time Dr. Roberts left the factory an hour later, she had no doubt that there had to be a serious health problem at the Glister Mary Lee popcorn plant, and that it very likely started in the mixing room. But she still could not pinpoint exactly what the problem was. So she decided that investigators would need to visit the factory one more time. And this time, they'd take samples of everything. The popcorn, the flavoring mixtures, the cleaning products, and any hint of dust or mold. Whatever was in there making these workers sick, she was determined to find it. A few weeks later, inside of a lab, Dr. Roberts, along with 2 lab researchers, stared into a big plastic rodent cage full of rats that they were using in an experiment. Dr. Roberts and her team had tested all the samples they had collected from the popcorn plant. They'd identified 100 different potentially toxic compounds in those samples, but none of them seemed to be what was making people sick. Dr. Roberts had been very frustrated, but she did have one more idea. There was one more chemical that she wanted to test on the rats. This chemical was normally considered to be safe to eat, but there had been very little research done on what would happen if someone inhaled it. And sure enough, after the rats breathed in a large amount of the chemical, their breathing became shallow and labored. Later, when examined under a microscope, their lungs were revealed to be inflamed and scarred, just like human victims of bronchiolitis obliterans. Dr. Roberts finally had her answer. This seemingly innocent chemical was causing the disease plaguing Martin and the other workers. The test that Dr. Roberts and her team did proved that it was the delicious-smelling butter-flavoring mixture that was making the workers sick. Specifically, a chemical in the mixture called diacetyl. Diacetyl is a naturally occurring substance found in things like beer, butter, cheese, and coffee, and it can be used as artificial flavoring. No one suspected diacetyl because the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, had already determined it was safe to eat. But Dr. Roberts realized the FDA never tested whether diacetyl was safe to breathe, and it definitely was not. And the factory where Martin worked was using 3 times the diacetyl found in most butter flavorings at other factories. The deadly fumes wreaked havoc on employees' skin and lungs, creating irreversible damage. But Martin and his coworkers were not the only popcorn factory workers in danger. In October of 2001, there were 140 popcorn plants in the United States, and they were all using this butter mixture with dangerous levels of diacetyl. Even worse, there were thousands of other businesses that either made or used butter flavoring with diacetyl. That meant thousands of workers nationwide were at risk of developing what came to be called popcorn lung disease. In December of 2003, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health issued warnings to more than 4,000 businesses that either made or used this butter flavoring. In response, 80% of American popcorn makers stopped using diacetyl in their butter flavoring and switched to something else. Now, this made current and future workers much safer, but this did nothing to curb the damage that had already been done by the diacetyl poisoning. One of the workers at Martin's factory was awarded $20 million for the damage to his health, and part of that settlement was intended to go to the factory's other victims, including Martin Henry. However, the comfort from that settlement would be short-lived, because Martin would die on May 22, 2010. He was only 62 years old. And now, here's our second story called Headache from Hell. In the late winter of 2023, 52-year-old Jacob Malloy stretched out in bed. He'd woken up late and was enjoying a lazy Sunday, petting his cat Gizmo, who was splayed out next to him on the bed. Finally, Jacob's stomach started to grumble, so he rolled out of bed and pulled back his curtains. A bright beam of sunshine filled his bedroom with light. He cracked open his window just enough to feel a cool but pleasant breeze sweep through his room. Jacob lived in Orlando, Florida, so even though it was February, it was a mild 60 degrees outside. Jacob heard the coffee maker percolating downstairs, and he knew that it was time to go join his wife Jessica for breakfast. So he went down to the kitchen and quickly invited Jessica to sit at the table while he made them both food. 30 minutes later, Jacob had bacon frying in a cast iron skillet on the stove while he poured pancake batter onto a searing hot griddle. After a minute, he flipped the pancakes, then he turned back to the stove to take the bacon out of the skillet. He timed it just right. The bacon was still soft and flopped gently onto his plate. He hated when bacon got too crispy. It tasted too dry. He used the grease from the bacon to fry up some hash browns and eggs, then carried 2 loaded plates over to the table. Jessica brought over the pot of coffee and then thanked her husband for the extravagant breakfast. Jacob winked and told Jessica not to tell his doctor. She laughed, but Jacob actually wasn't kidding. He was overweight and had type 2 diabetes. and so his doctor had told him a few times to lay off the greasy food. But Jacob figured what the doctor didn't know wouldn't hurt him. He dipped a forkful of hash browns into the golden yolk from his fried eggs and took a big, satisfying bite. A few weeks later, Jacob was out in the yard mowing the lawn when a sharp pain erupted in his temple. Jacob stopped the mower and beelined for the garage. He got migraines about once a month, so he knew what it felt like when one was coming on. Jacob called out to Jessica as he walked in through the garage door and jogged up the stairs. He got some headache medicine out of his nightstand and took 2 pills before collapsing onto his bed. Within a few minutes, a familiar ache began to pulse behind his temples. But instead of moving forward towards his forehead like usual, the pain seemed to migrate toward the back of his skull. And his migraine medication wasn't helping at all, which was unusual. It was strong stuff, and until now, it always seemed to do the trick. And so Jacob had no choice but to just bury his head in a pillow and ride out the pain. Finally, sometime that evening, the throbbing at the base of his skull subsided. It had been a shorter migraine, but so painful it didn't feel like he'd gotten off easy. 4 months later, Jacob sat in his primary care doctor's office, chatting with his physician while a nurse took his blood pressure. She frowned when she read the numbers aloud on the blood pressure sleeve. Jacob's doctor admitted they were a little high, but otherwise his vitals did seem fine. Jacob nodded. He expected a little bit of high blood pressure, given all the greasy food he'd been eating. But it was not high blood pressure that had brought Jacob to the doctors that morning. It was his migraines. Ever since that day he was out mowing his lawn, they'd become more and more frequent. Weekly instead of monthly. And they were really beginning to interfere with his life. Most recently, he'd been spending just about every weekend laid up in bed. The doctor found this very concerning, and he asked if Jacob was experiencing any other symptoms, like seizures or numbness or sensations he couldn't explain. Jacob thought for a moment, but then said no, everything else felt normal. The doctor nodded and told Jacob that he wanted to order a CT scan. If there was something going on in Jacob's brain, the CT scan would show it. An hour later, Jacob and the doctor looked at the CT scan image of Jacob's brain on a computer screen. The doctor pointed to small circular areas in the middle of the scan, and he said that they looked like cysts within the white matter of Jacob's brain. Cysts are tiny fluid-filled sacs. The doctor said cysts in the brain are never good news because they can cause a painful pressure buildup and even vision problems. The doctor explained that his biggest concern amongst these cysts was the cluster of cysts located at the bottom right-hand corner of Jacob's brain. He thought that those could actually be causing Jacob's symptoms, the headaches. Jacob reflexively moved a hand and touched the base of his skull. He told the doctor that actually, now that he thought about it, there had been one change in his migraines besides their frequency. Instead of throbbing right above his eyes the way they normally did, the pain had sort of moved to the back of his skull, to right where that cluster of cysts was located on the CT scan. The doctor told Jacob he was admitting him to the hospital immediately. He suspected that Jacob might have a rare condition called congenital neurological cysts, meaning that these cysts have been present in his head for his entire life. But now they could be growing and pressing against Jacob's brain, causing these intense headaches. If more tests showed that was the case, Jacob would need brain surgery to remove the cysts and stop the pressure. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The thought of brain surgery terrified him. He asked if he could have a few minutes to call his wife and have her come down to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Jacob sat upright in a hospital bed, with Jessica sitting beside him in a chair. A neurologist stood at the foot of the bed, holding a new scan of Jacob's brain on his tablet. He explained that the location and distribution of the cysts in Jacob's brain were unusual. In his opinion, Jacob did not have congenital neurological cysts. Jacob perked up and asked if that meant he didn't need brain surgery. But the doctor said he wasn't sure yet. There was definitely still something in Jacob's brain that shouldn't have been there. Then he began asking Jacob questions about his travel history, whether he'd ever visited a farm and what his house and living conditions were like. Jacob felt mildly confused, but answered the doctor's questions as best as he could. Neither he nor Jessica traveled very much. The last time they left home was 2 years ago when they'd taken a cruise from Miami to the Bahamas. and he'd never been on a farm. The closest he got to animals was petting his cat, Gizmo. The neurologist asked Jacob to walk him through a normal day in his life, including everything he liked to eat at mealtimes. Jacob was a bit embarrassed, but he admitted to the lavish breakfast that he liked to make on the weekends. Jacob had barely started talking when the neurologist stopped him and told Jacob he'd be right back. Then he hurried out of the room. Jacob was a bit surprised, but it seemed like the doctor had a new idea, and soon enough, the neurologist was back. He informed Jacob that he was ordering a full workup to test for infectious diseases. Jacob nodded, feeling as curious as he was frightened. But the next day, the neurologist gave Jacob a diagnosis that he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. The neurologist confirmed that Jacob did not have brain cysts, and Jacob felt instantly relieved by that. But the neurologist told Jacob to brace himself for the rest of the diagnosis. His migraines were being caused by foreign organisms that had somehow gotten into his brain. The round things that the doctor saw in his brain scan were living creatures, tapeworms to be precise. And the neurologist said they got there because of the fancy breakfasts that Jacob loves so much. Specifically, it had to do with the bacon. Jacob didn't like crispy bacon. He liked soft, chewy bacon, something he told the doctor. But that indicated that the bacon was undercooked. And so the theory was, at some point, some of that undercooked bacon must have been infected with tapeworm larvae, and then those larvae were not killed in the frying pan. Had it been cooked long enough, they would have been. But even so, the neurologist explained that the tapeworms would never have reached Jacob's brain if not for a second problem. The neurologist said that the tapeworm can only infect the brain when someone touches the feces that contain the tapeworm larva. The neurologist suspected that after Jacob ate the tapeworm larva from the undercooked bacon and then had a bowel movement containing the tapeworm larva, he must not have washed his hands properly and then touched his nose or mouth. After that, the larva made its way to Jacob's brain. Thankfully, the problem was treatable. The neurologist put Jacob on a 2-week regimen of antiparasitic and anti-inflammatory medications, which killed the tapeworms in his brain. Once the tapeworms were gone, his migraines improved. And so ultimately, Jacob learned a painful lesson in proper hygiene.
At the top of a tree sat, baby, you and me, happy as can be. I looked down at you, you were a tiny baby, oh. And then I woke up and decided I'ma lay around, rest today. Just like a little baby, I look like a baby. She said, man, you crazy, none of this amaze you. I said, not lately, got that rug this week. I'm just trying to sleep, all I want is peace, babe, yeah. I'd do anything, anything for, anything for. I do.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we do sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and also some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan.